Reading 17 of the CFA Level 1 program curriculum, Understanding Business Cycles. Learning outcomes. The candidate should be able to describe the business cycle and its phases, describe how resources used housing sector activity and external trade sectors activity vary and economy moves through the business cycles, describe theories and business cycles, describe types of unemployment and compare measures of unemployment, explain inflation, hyperinflation, disinflation, and deflation. Explain the construction of indexes used to measure inflation, compare inflation measures, including their use and limitations, distinguish between cost push and demand pull inflation, interpret the set of economic indicators, and describe their use and limitations. Introduction: agricultural societies experience good harvest times and bad ones. Weather is a main factor that influences crop production, but other factors such as plant and animal disease are also influenced the harvest. Modern diversified economies also are less influenced by weather and disease, but as with crops, there are fluctuations in economic output with good times and bad times. This reading addresses changes in economic activity and factors that affects it. Some of the factors that influence the short-term economic movement, such as changes in population, technology, and capital, are the same as those that affect long-term sustainable growth. Other factors such as money supply and inflation are more specific to short-term economic fluctuations. This reading is organized as follows. Section 2 describes the business cycle and its phases, the typical behavior of businesses and households in different phases and transitions between phases as prescribed. Section 3 provides an introduction to business cycle theory, in particular how different economic schools of thought interpret the business cycle and their recommendations with respect to it. Section 4 introduces basic concepts concerning unemployment and inflation, two measures of short-term economic activity and are important to economic policymakers. Section 5 discusses variables that demonstrate predictable relationship with economy, focusing on variables whose movement have value in predicting the future course of the economy. A summary and practice problems conclude the reading. 2. Overview of business cycles. Byrne and Mitchell, 1948, defines the business cycle as follows. Business cycles are a type of fluctuations found in the aggregate economic activity of a nation that organize the works, mainly in business enterprises. A cycle consists of expansion occurring the same time as in many economic activities, followed by a similarly general recession, contractions, and revival, which merge into expansion phase in the next cycle. This sequence of events reoccurs as recurrent but not periodic. A duration business cycles vary from much more than 1 year to 10 to 12 years. The long definition is rich with important insights. First, business cycles are typical economies that rely mainly on business enterprise, therefore no agrarian societies or centrally planned economies. Second, a cycle has an expected sequence of phase alternating between expansion and contraction. During such phases occurs at about the same time throughout the economy, that is not just in agriculture or not just in tourism, but in almost all sectors. Fourth, cycles are recurrent, i.e. they happen again and again over time, but not periodic, i.e. they do not have an exact same intensity and or duration. Finally, cycles typically last between 1 to 12 years. Although Burns and Mitchell's definition may appear obvious in part, it indeed remains helpful even more than 60 years after its writing. Although rule of thumb are often referred to when talking about market activity, e.g., shares always rally in January and big crashes occur in October. Reality is much more complex, as Byrne and Mitchell reminds us. The history never repeats itself in quite the same way, but it certainly offers patterns that can be used when analyzing the present and forecasting the future. 2.1 phases of the business cycle. A typical business cycle consists of 4 phases: through expansion, peak, contraction, and period. The period of expansion occurs after the the lowest period of business cycle, before its peak or the highest point. The peak and tough represents the turning points of the cycle. Contraction is the period after the peak and before the tough. During the expansion phase, aggregate economic activity is increasing. Aggregate is used because some individual economic sectors may not be growing. In contraction, they're called a recession. often called a recession, but may be called a depression when exceptionally severe is a period in which aggregate economic activity is declining, although some individual sectors may be growing. Business cycles can be thought of as functions around the trend of growth in the economy. Exhibit 1, panel 1. Exhibit 1, panel 1 shows a stylized representation of the business cycle. Panel B provides a description of some important characteristics of each cycle. The descriptive distinguishes between early and late stages of the expansion phase. The early stage is closer to the trough, and the late stage is closer to the peak. So this is what it looks like. Here's some characteristics. Pause the video, look at it. Okay. The behavior of businesses and households frequently incorporate leads and lags relative to what are established as turning points in the business cycle. For example, at the beginning of the expansion phase, companies may want to fully use their existing workforce and wait to hire new employees until they are sure that the economy is indeed growing. However, gradually, all economic variables are going to revert toward their normal range of values, e.g., GDP growth with a positive number. As the economy returns to normal, any counter-cyclical economic policies adopted by the central bank, the monetary authority in most modern economies, are gradually phased out. For example, if the central bank reduces interest rates to stimulate the economy during a recession, you may start increasing rates towards their historical norms. During a recession, investors place relatively high values on such safer assets as government securities and shares of companies with steady or growing positive cash flows, such as utilities and producers of stable goods. Such performances reflect the fact that marginal utility of a safe income stream increases the periods when employment is insecure or declining. When asset markets expect the end of the recession and the beginning of the expansionary phase, risky assets will be repriced upwards. When an expansion is expected, the markets will start incorporating higher profits expectations into the prices of corporate bonds and stocks, particularly those such cyclical companies as producers of discretionary goods, for example, automobiles. Typically, equity markets will hit a trough about 3 to 6 months before the economy bottom, and well before the economic indicators turn up. Indeed, the equity stock market is classified as the leading indicator of the economy. When the economy's expansion is well established, a later part of the expansion, called a boom, often follows. The boom is an expansionary phase which is characterized by economic growth, testing the limits of the economy. For example, companies may expand so much that they have difficulty finding qualified workers and will compete with other prospective employees by raising wages. The resulting rise in labor costs may lead to a reduction in profits. Another example is that companies may begin to believe that the economy will continue expanding for the foreseeable future and decide to borrow money to expand their production capacity. The government and or central bank may step in. If it is concerned about the economy overheating, consider the following situation. The central bank is concerned that excessive salary growth may lead to inflation. For example, company will try to pass on higher production costs to their consumers, or exercise borrowing may cause investors to have cash flow problems. At the height of the boom phase, the economy is said to be overheating, just like the engine of a car that's pushed to excessive levels. During the boom, the riskiest assets will often have substantial price increases. Safe assets such as government bonds will have more highly priced during the recession, may have lower prices and thus higher yields. In addition, investors may fear higher inflation, which are contributes of higher nominal yields. The end of an expansion or boom is characterized by a peak in the business cycle, which is the beginning of the contraction, also known as a downturn. Here, either because of restrictive economic policy established to tame the overheated economy, or because some of the stocks, such as energy prices or credit crisis, the economy stumbles and starts slowing down. Unemployment increases and GDP growth decreases during the parts of the business cycle. Investors who are often optimists in the expansion phase tend to be overly pessimistic at the bottom of the business cycle. It is worth noting that many business cycles and the duration of the economic contractions have been shorter than the durations of expansion. Many economic variables and sectors of the economy have distinctive cyclical patterns. Knowledge of these patterns can offer insight into likely cyclical directions overall, or it can be particularly applicable in an investment strategy that requires more specific rather than general cycle insights of investment success. The following section provides overview of how the use of resources, the factors of production typically evolves through the business cycle, and how the sector of real estate and external trade characteristics behave. Resource use through the business cycle. The section provides a broad overview of how the use of resources needed to produce goods and services typically evolve during a business cycle. There are significant links between fluctuations in inventory, employment, and investment in physical capital. With economic fluctuations, when a downturn starts, aggregate demand decreases and as a result, inventories may start to accumulate. Companies may slow production and have equipment that is being less used than a full capacity. Subsequently, companies are likely to stop ordering new inventories and new production equipment. Companies do not necessarily reduce their workforce immediately. Instead, they reduce costs by other means, such as eliminating overtime. If it is just a temporary economic slowdown, retaining workers that are not fully utilized may be a better alternative than firing workers and replacing them later. Finding and training new workers is costly, and it may be more cost effective to keep workers on the payroll, even if they are not fully utilized, while waiting out a short period of slow business. Second, some economists suggest that there are an implicit bond of loyalty between a company and its workers, and thus workers will be more productive if they know that the company is not disposing them of at the first sign of economic trouble. If the downturn becomes more severe, companies will start reducing costs more aggressively, cutting all non-essential costs. This step often means terminating consultants, workers beyond the strict minimum, standing supply orders, advertising campaigns, and so on. Capacity utilization will be low, and few companies will invest in new equipment and structures. Companies will try to liquidate their inventories of unsold products. In addition, banks will be reluctant to lend because bankruptcy rates are perceived to be higher. As a result, the economy enters what seems to be a downward spiral. The gap between the recessionary gap, or GDPR, and the potential output, or the GDPP, are the levels of real GDP can be achieved if all resources were fully utilized. An indicator of the slack resources, unemployment of labor, and idleness of physical capital. Decreases in aggregate demand are likely to depress wages or wage growth as well as prices of inputs and capital goods. After a while, all these input prices will be relatively very low. In addition, the monetary authorities may cut interest rates to try to revive the economy. As the prices of and interest rates decrease, consumers and companies may begin to purchase more, and aggregate demand may begin to rise. Companies may increase production as a result of increased demand and low levels of inventory of finished products. Also, because interest rates have fallen, some companies and households may decide to start investing in structures, houses, and durable goods, equipment for companies, appliances for households. The stage is the turning point of the business cycle. Aggregate demand starts to increase and economic activity increases. When economic activity increases, companies are likely to immediately start the costly process of selecting and hiring new workers. They may wait for expansion to give a clear sign of life. However, if enough new investment triggers an increase in aggregate demand, companies will start replenishing their inventories of finished products. This replenishment will increase the demand for intermediate products, which will further increase aggregate demand. This stage is often called inventory rebuilding. or restocking in the financial press, and may be followed by additional increases in capital expenditures. Demand for all factors of production, land, labor, material, and physical capital increases. As aggregate demand continues to grow, a boom phase of the cycle begins. In a boom phase, the economy may experience shortages, and demand for factors of production may exceed supply. It is possible that excess demand is triggered by over-optimistic expectations of demand for products, which means that supply of physical capital and production capacity may exceed the demand for products in the future. Past examples of excessive supply attributable to overinvestment include fiber optic infrastructure during the 1990 booms and residential overbuilding in many countries during the 2000s housing bubble. This overinvestment, which results in unused productive capacity, is possible to trigger the next recession. 2.2.1 Fluctuations in capital spending. This section describes how capital spending on tangible goods such as property, plants, and equipment typically fluctuates with the business cycle. Because business profits and cash flows are sensitive to changes in economic activity, capital spending is also sensitive to changes in economic activity. Shifts in capital spending tend to affect the overall economic cycle in three stages or phases. In the early stage of a contraction, the downturn of spending on equipment usually occurs abruptly as demand for companies' products start to decrease. Businesses seeing a decrease in sales and expecting a drop in profits and free cash flow will halt new orders and may even cancel existing orders because there are no perceived needs to expand production capacity. The initial cuts typically occur in order for technology and light equipment because there are shorter lead times for order to delivery, and managers may simply not place an additional order. It often takes longer to cancel or halt construction activity or the installation of larger, more complex pieces of equipment. The cutbacks in these areas unfold with no lag. Typically, the initial cutbacks are stage exaggerated of the economy's contractions. Then later, as the general cyclical downturn matures, cutbacks in spending on structures and heavy equipment further intensifies the contraction. In the early stages of an expansion, when an economy begins to recover, sales are still at such low levels that a business is likely to have excess productive capacity and have little need to expand it. But although capacity utilization remains low, capital spending may begin to increase. There are two primary reasons underlying the increase in capital spending. One, growth in earnings and free cash flow attributed to the economic improvement gives businesses the financial ability to increase spending. Two, the upturn in sales may convince managers to reinstate some orders that had been canceled. Typically, the order initially reinstated are for equipment with a high rate of obsolescence, such as software systems and technological hardware. This type of equipment is likely to enhance efficiency more than expected capacity. Enhancing efficiency may be the initial force of new orders. An increase in new orders for equipment to enhance efficiency often provides the first signal, but because order actual shipment and possible payments, and emphasize the widely watched indicator of future directions of capital spending for capital equipment. In a later stage of expansion, productive capacity may begin to limit ability to respond to demand. Orders and sales at this stage focus on capacity expansions increasingly are for heavy and complex equipment. Warehouses and factories spending new capacity may before capacity seems to need addition. This seeming disconnect occurs because there can be a long lag between order and delivery or competition of heavy and complex equipment, warehouses, factories, and so on. Also because economies are always changing their needs. Physical capital that counts as capital in the statistics may be less relevant to current production needs, even though the underlying asset remains fully serviceable. The compensation of the economy's capital may not be optimal for the current economic situations, necessitating spending for new capital. A company, for instance, that needs more transportation equipment cannot subsidize with a surplus of forklifts, although they are counted in overall capacity similarly. Similarly, a company that needs a warehouse space in a suburb of Mumbai benefits little from surplus warehouse space in Goa. The increase in capital spending to increase capacity may occur surprisingly soon after capacity utilization picks up. Now, orders intended to increase capacity may be an early indicator of the late stage of the expansionary phase. Fluctuation in inventory levels, inventory accumulation, and cutbacks by businesses can occur with such speed and frequency that they have a much greater effect on the economy than justified by their relative small aggregate size relative to the economy as a whole. A key indicator in this area is the inventory sales ratios that measures the inventory available for sale to the level of sales. The interactions of the gauge of the cycle develops in three distinct stages. Towards the peak of the economic cycle, as sales falls or slows, businesses may lag in cutting back on new production and inventory increases. The lower sales combined with higher inventories result in an increase in inventory sales ratios. This apparent increase in inventories may hide signs of weakening economies. Practitioners, investment analysts, and others look for measures that focuses on what are commonly called final sales, which excludes the effect of inventory changes to adjust the sales of these unwanted inventories. A businessman cuts production below even the reduced sales level. This cut in production causes subsequent indicators in overall economy to look weaker than they otherwise would have been. Although final sales offers a reality check, the production cutbacks involved in reducing inventory levels may lead to order cancellation and layoff by producers that may subsequently cut final sales further and deepen cyclical correlation. With businesses producing at rates below the sales volumes necessary to dispose of unwanted inventories, inventory sales ratio begins to fall back towards normal. With these indicators return to acceptable levels and businesses no longer have any need to further reduce inventories, they will raise production levels. The increase in production results in seemingly improved economic situation, even if sales remain depressed. Again, final sales may provide a more realistic picture of the underlying economic situation as this phase in the cycle. The seemingly minor increase in production levels can actually make the beginning of the cyclical term, because layoffs may slow or stop the demand, and other inputs may also increase. The sales begin their cyclical upturn. A business may initially fail to keep production on pace with sales, which causes to lose inventory to the initial sales increase. The subsequent fall in inventory sales ratio, when it occurs in the face of rising sales quickly prompts a surge in production, not only to catch up with sales but also to replenish depleted inventories. However, sometimes during short or severe recessions, when businesses have not had time to adjust to reduce inventories to acceptable levels, companies may initially consider increased production unnecessary. As a result, the lag between increasing sales and production may be longer than other cycles, but whether the production upturn occurs with a short or long run, it typically marks a turn in hiring patterns, and for a time can markedly exaggerate the cyclical strength. 2.2.3 Consumer behavior. Households represent the largest single sector of every developed economy. For example, 70% in the United States economy. As a result, patterns of household consumption determines overall economic direction more than any other sector. Patterns of household consumption are important to practitioners a variety of reasons. For example, quantity analyst covers consumer products companies with a high. Sorry for the technical issue just happened. I'm going to continue my reading. Beyond direct observations of consumer spending and its mix, practitioners can also gauge future directions by analyzing measures of consumer confidence and sentiments of assertion, how aggressive consumers may be in their spending. Usually, such information is in the form of a survey intended to provide practitioners with a general guide to trend, but in practice, they frequently do not reflect the actual consumer behavior because surveys respondents may answer what they imagine are preferences of the typical consumers, indicating behavior contrary to their own. Growth income is typically a better indicator of consumption prospects, and household income figures are widely available in most countries. Especially relevant is after-tax income, or what is frequently called disposable income. Some analysts chart consumer spending based on the concept term permanent income. Permanent income excludes temporary income and unsustainable losses and gains, and tries to capture the income flow on which households believe they can rely. The basic level of consumption reflects the notion of permanent income. However, spending on durable tends to rise and fall with disposable income rather of a source, not just permanent income. But consumer spending patterns frequently diverge from trends in income, no matter how it is measured. And analysts of the savings rate can assist practitioners in this regard. Cross-border comparisons of saving rates are difficult because savings rates are calculated in different ways in different countries, and sometimes it's different ways within the same country. But because all measures of saving rates aim is one way or another to measure the percentage of households' income set aside for spending, changes in savings rate can capture consumers' intent and reduce spending out of current income. The saving rate may also reflect future income uncertainties perceived by consumers, or the precautionary savings. Therefore, a higher savings rate may indicate consumers' ability to spend despite lower income in the future. A rise in savings rate, usually measured as a percentage of income, may indicate caution among households and signal economic weakness. At the same time, the greater the stock of saving in the household sector, and the wider the wider gap between ongoing income and spending, the greater the capacity for households to increase their spending. So although unusually high savings may at first say something negative about the cyclical outlook, they point longer term to the potential for recovery. 3.2 Household sector behavior. Although generally a much smaller part of the overall economy for consumer spending, household activity experiences dramatic swings that often counts more in overall economic activity than the sector's relatively small size might suggest. Although almost every major economy offers statistics on new and existing home sales, residential construction activities, and sometimes importantly, because many home buyers finance their purchase with a mortgage, the sector is especially sensitive to interest rates. Home buyers are consequentially construction activity expand in response to lower mortgage rates and contract in response to higher mortgage rates. Beyond such, inflation rate affects housing also follows its own internal cycle. When housing prices are low relative to average incomes, and especially when mortgage rates are also low, the cost of owning a house falls and demand for housing increases. Often indicators of cost of owning a house and available to compare with households' incomes with the cost of supporting an average house. both its price and the expense of a typical mortgage. Commonly, household prices and mortgage rates rise disproportionately as expansionary cycles mature, bring on an increase in relative household housing costs. Even as household income rises, the resulting slowdown of housing sales can lead to cyclical downturns, first in buying and then the inventory of unsold houses builds is actual construction activity. These links, clear as they are far from mechanical. If housing prices have risen rapidly in the recent past, for instance, many people will buy to gain exposure to the expected price gains, even as the purchase in other respects becomes harder. To rationalize, such behaviors can extend the cycle upwards to and result in more severe corrections. This result occurs because the late buying activity invites overbuilding. The large inventory of unsold homes eventually puts downwards pressure on real estate prices, catching late buyers who have stretched their resources. This pattern occurred in many countries during the 2008 to 2009 global financial crisis. Behind such cyclical considerations, housing, more than most economic sectors, respond to demographic, in particular, the pace of family or household formation in an economy. Not every economy has data on family formation, but almost all offers information on the growth of particular age groups or cohorts in their respective population. A focus of their cohorts, typically 25 to 40-year-olds, when household formation commonly occurs, usually can substitute for direct measures of net family formation adjusted for older people who are vacating existing homes. Such calculations serve as an indicator of underlying longer term secular housing demand. Although such measures have little to do with business cycles, they do offer a gauge along with affordability of how quickly the housing market can correct excess and returns to growth. In China, for instance, where the government estimated a need for about 400 million more urban housing units over the following 25 years, housing demand may quickly reverse a cyclical weakness than such economies of Italy or Japan, where net new family formation is relatively slight. 4.2 External trade sector behavior. The external trade sector varies tremendously in size and importance from one economy to another. In such places as Singapore, where almost all inputs are imported and the bulk of the economy's output finds its way to the export market, trade in some of both exports and imports easily exceeds the GDP. In other places, such as the United States, external trade assumes a much smaller part of GDP. Since the 1970s, the relative size of external trade has grown in almost every country in the world. With the rise of external trade, business cycles of the large economies in the world can be more easily transmitted to other economies. Typically, imports rise or else equals with the pace of domestic GDP growth, as needs and wants of generally rising demand and increased purchases of goods and services from abroad. Thus, imports respond to domestic cycles. Exports are more dependent on cycles in the rest of the world. If these external cycles are strong or else equal, exports will grow even if the economy should experience a decline in growth. To understand the impact of exports, financial analysts need to understand the strengths of the major trading partners of the economy under considerations. Most practitioners look at the net difference between exports and imports. They use the balance of payments, which calculates trade's contributions to the economy as exports less imports. The net effect of trade may offset cyclical weakness, and depending on the imports and of exports to the economy, could erase it altogether. For these reasons, such differences can mean the pattern of external trade balance is entirely different from the rest of the domestic economic cycle. Currency also has an independent effect on that can move trade in directions strikingly different from the domestic economic cycle. When a nation's currency appreciates, the currency gains its strength relative to other currencies. Foreign goods seems cheaper than domestic goods. To the domestic population, promoting all else equal the relative rise in imports. At the same time, such currency appreciation make the nation's exports more expensive in the global market and may reduce exports. Of course, currency depreciation has the opposite effect. Although currency moves may be volatile and occasion extreme, they only have a significant effect on the trade and the balance of payments when they accumulate in a single direction for some time. Moves from 1 month to a quarter or quarter to the next, however great, have a minimal effect until they persist. Thus, cumulative currency movements and take place over a period of years will have an impact on trade flows that will persist even if the currency the subsequent moves in the opposite direction for the temporary period. Financial analysts needs to consider a wide range of variables both in the domestic economy and abroad to assess relative GDP growth rates, and then factor in currency considerations to ascertain whether they reinforce other cyclical forces or counteract them. Generally, GDP growth differentials in global economic growth rates between countries have the most immediate and straightforward effects. Domestic changes in economic activities rise or reduce imports, and foreign economic activity changes rise or reduce exports. Currency moves have a more complex, and despite the interim short-term currency moves a more gradual effect. Theories of bullish cycles. Business cycles have been recognized since the early days of economic theory, and considerable efforts have gone into identifying different cycles and explaining them. Until the 1930s, however, the general view was that they were a natural feature of the economy, and the pain of a recession is temporary. But the depth and severity of the 1930s downturn, also known as the Great Depression, created a crisis in economic theory. After the Great Depression, which began in 1929, the debate between various economic schools of thought, neoclassical, Austrian, and Keynesian, spurred changes in the ways the business cycle was described and explained. Similarly, after recessions triggered by the oil shock of 1973 and 1979, old paradigms were taken apart, and new developments in economic and quantitative methods led to an improved understanding of short-term economic dynamics. In this section, we will review and summarize some of the main theories. Neoclassical and Austrian schools. Neoclassical analysis relies on the concept of general equilibrium, that is, all markets will reach equilibrium because of the invisible hand or free market, and a price will be found for every good at which supply equals demand. All resources are used efficiently based on the principle of marginal cost equaling marginal revenue, and no involuntary unemployment of labor or capital takes place. In theory, if a shock of any origin shifts either the aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve, the economy will quickly readjust and reach the equilibrium through lower interest rates and lower wages. In practice, because the neoclassical school provides the invisible hand, will reallocate capital and labor so that they will be used to produce whatever consumers want. It does not allow for fluctuations found in these aggregate economic activity. Neoclassical economists relies on Say's law. All that is produced will be sold because supply creates its own demand. French economist B.J. Say pointed out that if something is produced, the capital and labor used for the production will have to be compensated. The compensation of the factor interest for capital and wages for labor creates purchasing power in the sense that the workers receive a paycheck and thus can buy goods and services they need. Widespread declines in demand would be strictly temporary. The neoclassical school does not have a theory of the business cycle, and the closest it got is the Schumpeter's creative destruction theory, which shows cycles within industries as a result of technological progress, but no economic-wide fluctuations. Schumpeter's counter-formulation is a theory of innovations, which explains a cycle limited to individual industries. When an investor comes up with new products, e.g. digital music players in recent decades, or new, better ways to produce an existing good or service, e.g. radio frequency identification, tracking, or inventories, then the entrepreneur that introduces the new discovery will have bigger profits and may drive the existing producers out of business. Therefore, innovation can generate crisis and affect only the industry affected by the new invention. Neoclassical economists recognizes that business cycles exist but treats them as temporary disequilibria. In the neoclassical school, massive crisis such as the Great Depression of the 1930s, without widespread unemployment of more than 20% throughout the industrialized world is impossible, yet it happened. The crisis stated in the United States is unsuccessfully affected many other countries. The 1929 crisis touched many sectors at the same time and in a dynamic fashion because the neoclassical theory denied the possibility of a prolonged depression. It could not be used to explain how to fight such a depression. The main adjustment mechanism proposed by the neoclassical school, cuts in wages, was difficult to achieve, and as we shall see, we questioned by the Keynesian school. The Austrian school, including F. von Hayek and L. von Mises, shared some views of the neoclassical school, but focused more on two topics that were largely unimportant. In the neoclassical framework, the rules of money and government. Money was not necessarily in the neoclassical model because the exchange of goods and services could occur in the form of barter and still reach the general equilibrium. Money was seen just as a way to simplify exchanges. Similarly, the rule of government in the neoclassical model was quite limited because the economy could take care of itself and little else was needed of the economies besides upholding the law and securing the borders. The Austrian school has a theory of what causes the business cycle. It is misguided government intervention. Von Hayek argued that fluctuations are caused by governments and they try to increase GDP and employment, thus perhaps increasing voter consensus by adapting expansionary monetary policies. Governments lower the market interest rates below the natural value. Aggregate demand shifts right and thus leads companies to over-invest or inflationary gap. Once companies realize that they have accumulated too much equipment and too many structures, they will suddenly stop investing, which depresses aggregate demand. Aggregate demand shifts left dramatically and causes a crisis throughout the economy. To reach the new equilibrium, all prices, including wages, must decrease. As a result of manipulating interest rates, and economy exhibits fluctuations that would not have happened otherwise. Therefore, Austrian economists advocate limited government intervention in the economy, lest the government causes a boom and bust cycle. The best thing to do in the recession phase is to allow the necessary market adjustments to take place as quickly as possible. 3.2 Keynesian and monetarist schools. The Keynesian monetarist schools of economic thought have been among the most influential. Their prescription concerning the business cycle are discussed in the following section. The Keynesian school, as previously mentioned, if a recession occurs, the neoclassical and Austrian schools argue in general that no government intervention is needed. Unemployment and excess supply of goods will be solved by allowing market prices to decrease, including wages, until all market clears, supply equals demand, and factors of production are fully employed. The British economist John Maynard Keynes disagreed with both neoclassical and Austrian views. He observed that a generalized price and wages reduction slowly brought about through market forces necessary to bring markets back to equilibrium during a recession would be hard to attain. For example, workers may not want to see their nominal compensation decrease because nobody likes a pay cut. But Keynes thought that even if workers argued to accept lower salaries, this situation might exacerbate the crisis by reducing aggregate demand rather than solving it by lowering wages. Expectations would shift aggregate demand left. For example, if wages falls, workers would need to cut back on their spending. This response will cause a further contractions in the demand for all sorts of goods and services, starting from more expensive items such as durable goods and moving to domino effects through the economy, the downward spiral and of the economic demand curve continuously shifting left, as mentioned earlier. Furthermore, Keynes believed there could be circumstances in which lower interest rates would not renegade growth because business confidence or the animal spirit was too low. As a consequence, Keynes advocated government intervention in the form of fiscal policy, while he accepted a possibility that a market will reach the equilibrium revisioned by neoclassical and Austrian economists over the long run. He famously quipped that in the long run, we are all dead. This is the human suffering is extensive while waiting all shocks to be absorbed for the economy to return to equilibrium. When crisis occurs, the government should intervene to keep capital and labor employment by deliberately running large fiscal deficits. This intervention will limit the damage of major recessions. Although this concept continues to be a highly politically charged debate, most economists agrees that government expenditure can limit the negative effect of major economic crisis in the short term. The practical criticism that are often expressed about Keynesian fiscal policies are fiscal deficits means higher government debt that needs to be serviced and repaid eventually. There is a danger that government finance can move out of control. Keynesian cyclical policies are forced on the short term. In the long term, the economy may come back and presents. And the presence of the expansionary policy may cause it to overheat, that is, to have unsustainable fast economic growth, which causes inflation and other problems. This result is because the typical lag involves in expansionary policies taking effect on the economy. Fiscal policies takes time to implement quite often, but the time stimulatory fiscal policy kicks in, the economy is already recovering. Monetary policies determines the available quantities of money and loans in the economy. Keynes' writings do not advocate a continuous presence of government in the economy, nor does it suggest the economic policies to fine-tune the business cycle. He only advocates decisive actions in case of serious economic crisis, such as the Great Depression. This was really important. The neoclassical view, and then so I'm going to end my reading here. We're going to continue part 4 reading 17 in our next section of our reading, and I hope my readings have been helpful, and I hope to see you guys there. Goodbye. Continued reading of the CFA Level 1 program curriculum. Employment and inflation. Many governments and central banks have economic policies, objectives related to limiting the rate at which citizens are unemployed and containing price inflation, i.e. preserving the purchasing power of domestic currency. The relationship of these variables to the business cycles are discussed in the following section. In general, unemployment is at its highest just as the recovery starts and at its lowest at the peak of the economy. Unemployment, a typical cause of the business cycle downturn, is a tight labor market. That is one with low unemployment. An overheated economy leads to inflation when unemployment is very low. Workers ask for higher wages because they expect prices of goods and services to keep going up, and at the same time they have market power against employers because there are a few available workers to be hired. This upwards pressures on the wages, coupled with the impact of wages escalating, causes automatic increases in wages. As the consumer price index grows, triggers a wage inflation spiral. The issue of this particular problem as industrialized countries in the 1960s and 70s remained an issue today. A key aspect of this process is inflation expectations. Because inflation expectations are high, the request for higher wages is stronger, which induces employers to increase prices and advance to keep their profits margins stable. This avalanche process grows with time. Central banks act sometimes drastically to slow the economy to reset inflationary expectations throughout the economy at a low level, so that if everyone expects low inflation, the inflationary spiral will stop. These actions may trigger a deep recession. Therefore, whenever a financial analyst sees signs of a wage spiral in the making, a reasonable response would be to consider the effects of both high inflation and sharp tightening of monetary policy. This example shows that measures of labor market conditions are important in assessing whether an economy is at risk of a cyclical downturn. The following are the definitions of a few terms that are used to summarize the state of the labor market. Employed, the number of people with a job. The figure normally are not included people in the informal sector, e.g. unlicensed cab drivers, illegal workers, etc. Labor force, the number of people who are either have a job or are looking for a job. The number excludes retirees, children, stay-at-home parents, full-time students, and other categories of people who are neither employed nor actively seeking employment. Unemployed, people who are actively seeking unemployment but are currently without a job. Some special subcategories include long-term unemployment, people who have been out of work for a long time, more than 3 or 4 months in many countries, but are still looking for a job. Frictionally unemployed, people who are not working at the time or filling out the statistical surveys because they are taking time to search for a job that matches their skills, interests, and other preferences because better than what is currently available, or people who have left one job and are about to start one other. The frictional unemployed includes people who have voluntarily left the previous order of job in order to be, in other words, they are between jobs. And these new entrants of new reach are into the job force are not yet found work. Frictional employment is short-term and transitionary in nature. Unemployment rate is the ratio of employed to the labor force. Activity ratio, participation ratio, the ratio of labor force to total population of working age, i.e. between 16 and 40 and 64. Underemployed, a person who has a job but has the qualifications to work at a significantly higher paying job. For example, a lawyer who is out of work and takes a job at the bookstore could call herself underemployed. This lawyer would count as employed for the computation of employment rate. She does have a job, even if it may not be her highest paying job. Although the unemployment rate statistics is criticized for not taking the issue of underemployment into account, it may be difficult to classify whether a person is truly underemployed. For example, a lawyer may find legal work too stressful and prefers working at a bookstore. However, data for part-time working is sometimes a good proxy. Discouraged worker, the person who has stopped looking for a job perhaps because of a weak economy. The discouraged worker has given up seeking for employment. Discouraged workers are statistically outside the labor force, similar to children and retirees, which means they are not counted in the official unemployment rate. During a prolonged recession, this unemployment rate may actually decrease because many discouraged workers stop seeking work. It is important to observe the participation rate towards the unemployment rate. Voluntarily unemployment, a person voluntarily outside the labor force, such as a jobless worker refusing an available vacancy for the wages is lower than their threshold, or those who who retired early. Unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is certainly the most quoted measure of unemployment. It attempts to measure those people who have no work but work if they could find it. Generally stated as a percentage of the overall labor force in the United States, the indicator emerges for a monthly survey of households by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, which asks how many household members have jobs and how many of working age do not have jobs but are seeking work. Other statistical bureaus rely on other sources for calculations using claims for unemployment assistance, for instance, or their equivalents. Some statistical bureaus measure the labor force simply as those of working age, regardless of whether they are willing to work. Those differences can make a precise international comparisons problematic. One solution is the International Labor Organization (ILO) statistics to try to estimate on the consistent basis. As indicated earlier, some statistical agencies add perspective with other measures. For example, what proportion of those who have ceased work are discouraged and underemployed or have opted out for the labor force for other reasons or are working part-time. Although these various employment measures provide insight to the state of the economy, they are inaccurate in pointing to cyclical directions for two primary reasons, both of which make unemployment a lagging economic indicator of the business cycle. One reason is that unemployment rate tends to point to past economic conditions. That is, it lags the cycle because the labor force expands and declines in response to economic environment, compounding the inaccuracy. When time gets hard, discouraged workers cease searching for work, reducing the number of typically counted as unemployed, and making the job market look stronger than it really is. Conversely, when a job market picks up, those people return to the search, and because they seldom find work immediately, they are less initially raise the calculation of these unemployed, giving a false impression that of the lack of recovery in jobs market, when in fact improvement that has brought the people back into the labor force in the first place. Sometimes a cyclical flow of new job seekers is so great that the unemployment rate actually rises even as the economic recovery gains momentum. These agencies that measures the labor force in terms of the working age populations avoid this bias because this measure of working age population is unaffected by economic conditions in the labor market. But this approach introduces biases of its own, such as counting the unemployed, those people who have severe disabilities and could never seek work. The second reason the unemployment indicator tends to lag the cycle comes in the typical reluctance of businesses to lay off people. The reluctance may stem from a desire to retain good workers for the long run or reflect constraints and work written into labor contracts to make layoff expensive. The reluctance makes the various measures of unemployment rise more slowly as the economy slides into recession than it otherwise must. Then as the recovery develops, the business waits to hire until it has fully employed the workers it had kept on the payroll during the recession. This delays causes of decreases in the unemployment rate to lag in the cycle recovery, sometimes for a long time. Overall payroll, employment, and productivity indicators. To get a better picture of the employment cycle, practitioners often rely on more straightforward measures of payroll growth by measuring the size of payroll. Practitioners sidestep each issue as the ebb and flow of discouraged workers. The statistics, however, do have biases of their own. It is hard, for instance, to count employment in smaller businesses, which may be significant drivers of economic growth, since there is a clear indication of economic trouble when payrolls shrink and clear indicators of recovery when they rise. The examination of the other measures can also assist in the understanding of employment situations and its use in the determining of cyclical directions. Two additional measures are hours worked, especially overtime, and the use of temporary work. A business does not want to make mistakes of full-time staff hiring or firing. Thus, at first sign of economic weakness, managers cut back hours, especially over time. Such movements can simply reflect minor month-to-month production shifts, but it follows the cutbacks in part-time and temporary staff. The picture gives a strong signal of economic weakness, especially if confirmed by other independent indicators. Similarly, in the cyclical upswing, business turns from the increase in overtime and hours. If a business then increases temporary staffing, it gives a good signal of economic recovery long before any movement in rehiring full-time staff again, especially if it confirms independent cyclical movements. Productivity measures also offers insight into the cyclical process. Because productivity is usually measured by dividing output by hours, a business's tendency to keep workers on the payroll even as output falls usually prompts a reduction in measured productivity. If measures are unavailable promptly enough, the sign of cyclical weakness might proceed even to change in history in hours. This drop in productivity precedes any change in full-time payroll. Productivity also responds promptly when business conditions improves and the business first begins to utilize the underemployed workers, which occurs earlier than any upturn in full-time payroll. On the more fundamental level, productivity can also pick up in response to technological breakthroughs or improved training techniques. As already mentioned, such changes affect potential GDP. If strong enough, they can negatively affect employment trends, keeping them slower than they would be otherwise by relieving the need for additional staff to increase production. But these influences usually unfold over decades and mean little to cyclical considerations, which at most unfolds over years. What is more, there are few statistical indicators to gauge the onset of technological change, confining analysts to use the anecdotal evidence of occasional longitudinal studies. Example 9, here's just an example. 4.2 inflation. The overall price level changes are varying rates during different phases of the business cycle. Thus, when studying business cycles, it is important to understand the phenomenon in general. The inflation rate is pre-cyclical. That is, it goes up and down with the cycle, but with a lag of 1 year or more. Inflation. I'm drinking coconut water, by the way, today. I chilled it, and it's very it's really thick. Okay. Anyways, inflation refers to the sustained rate, so the sustained rise in the overall level of prices in the economy. Economists use various price indexes to measure the overall price level, also called the aggregate price level. The inflation rate is the percentage change in price index, that is the speed of overall price level movements. Investors follow the inflation rate closely, not only because it helps to infer the state of the economy, but also because the unexpected changes may result in change in monetary policy, which can turn have a large and immediate impact on asset prices. In developing economies, very high inflation rates can lead to social unrest or even shifts in political power, which constitutes political risk for investment in these economies. Central banks, the monetary authority, and most economies monitor the domestic inflation rate closely when conducting monetary policy. Monetary policy determines interest rates and the available quantity of money and loans in the economy. High interest and high inflation rate combined with a fast economic growth and low unemployment usually indicates the economy is overheating, which may trigger some policy movements to cool it down. However, if a high inflation rate is combined with a high level of unemployment and a slowdown in the economy, the economic state is known as stagflation. Stagnant plus inflation. The economy will typically be left to correct itself because no short-term economic policy is thought to be effective. Deflation, hyperinflation, disinflation. There are various terms related to the levels of changes in inflation rate. Deflation. A sustained decrease in aggregate price levels, which corresponds to a negative inflation rate, that is an inflation rate that is less than 0%. Hyperinflation, an extremely fast increase in aggregate price levels, which corresponds to extremely high inflation rate, for example, 500% to 1,000% a year. Disinflation, a decline in the inflation rate from 15 to 20% to 5 to or 6%. Disinflation is very different from deflation because even after a period of disinflation, the inflation rate remains positive and aggregate price levels keep rising, although at a slower speed. Inflation means that some amount of money can purchase less real goods or services in the future. So the money or purchasing power of money decreases in the inflationary environment. When deflation occurs, the value of money actually increases. Because most debt contracts are written in fixed monetary amounts, the liability of the borrower also rises in real time during inflation. As the price level falls, the revenue of typical companies also fall during a recession, facing increasing real debt. A company that is short on cash usually cuts its spending, investments, and workforce sharply. Less spending and high unemployment then further exacerbates the economic contraction. To avoid getting too close to this deflation, the consensus on preferred inflation rate is around 2% per year for developed countries. Deflation occurred in the United States during the Great Depression and briefly during the recession following the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. Since the late 1990s, Japan has experienced severe episodes of deflation. Hyperinflation usually occurs when large-scale economic spending is not backed by real tax revenue, and the monetary authorities accommodates government spending by increasing the money supply. Hyperinflation may also be caused by the shortage of supply created during something after a war. Economic regime transitions or prolonged economic distress of an economy caused by political instability. During hyperinflation, people are eager to change their cash into real goods because prices are rising very fast. As a result, money changing hands are extremely high frequencies. The government also has to print more money to support the increasing spending. As more cash chases a limited supply of goods and services, the rate and prices of increases accelerates. After World War I, a famous case of hyperinflation occurs in Germany from 1923 to 1924. During peak of this period, prices doubled every 3.7 days. After World War II, Hungary experiences severe hyperinflation. During the prices doubled 15.6 hours. At its peak in 1946 and 1993, the inflation rate of Ukraine peaked at 10,000 plus percent per year. In January 1994, the monthly inflation rate peaked at 313 million percent in Yugoslavia. The most recent hyperinflation in Zimbabwe peaked monthly inflation rate of 79.6 billion percent in the middle of November 2008. Because the basic key cause of hyperinflation is too much money in circulations, regaining control of this money supply is key to ending hyperinflation. Exhibit 2 shows recent episodes of disinflation in selected countries around the world. The fixed episodes occurs in 1980s because of the two oil crises of the 1970s. Many countries around the world were experiencing high levels of inflation. In Exhibit 2, the annual inflation rate is in more countries around 1980 ranged between 10% and 20%. Even though this level is still far from hyperinflation, it regenerates social pressure against inflationary monetary policy, as the cost of a severe recession earlier in the 1980s. These countries brought inflation rates down to around 5% on average by 1985. In the first years of 1990s, the inflationary experience varied widely in the world market, as some countries entered recessions, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, and others boomed. However, from the beginning of the end of the decade to the end of the decade was a broad-based decline in inflation rates in some countries. Annual inflation rate was below 2% by the end of the decade. In many countries, the decline in inflation rate was attributed to high productivity growth rates. Measuring inflation, the construction of price indexes, because the inflation rate is measured as a percentage change in price index. It is important to understand how a price index is constructed so that the inflation rate derived from the index can be accurately interpreted. A price index represents the average prices of baskets of goods and services. The various methods can be used to average the different prices. Exhibit 3 shows a simple example of how the changes of a consumption bracket changes over time. From January 2010, the total value of the consumption basket is value of rice plus, so this is the consumption basket. A price index created by holding the compositions of the consumption basket constates is called the Les Paris index. Most price indexes around the world are Les Paris indexes because the survey data and the consumption basket are the only available when a lag. In most countries, the basket is updated every 5 years because the most price indexes are created to measure the cost of living. Simply using a fixed basket of goods and services has 3 serious biases: the substitution bias, quality bias, and new product bias. And a relatively easy to resolve the quality bias and new product bias. Many countries adjust for the quantity of the products in the basket, a practice called hedonic pricing. New products can be introduced into the baskets over time. The situation bias can be somewhat resolved by using chain price index formulas. One such example is the Fisher index, which is the geometric mean of the Lorentz index, and the Passage index. So here's the Passage index. As shown in Exhibit 4, in different countries, the consumer price index have different names and different weights on various categories of goods and services. For example, food weights are higher for the CPI for China and India, but less for developed countries. A greater portion of the income of the average consumer goes to food in the developing country of China and India than in the developed countries. As shown in Exhibit 4, the scope of the index is also different among countries. For Japan, China, and Germany, the survey used to collect it for CPI covers both urban and rural areas. The CPI of the United States cover only urban areas using a household survey. The producer price index, the household price index, these are all just different indexes. You can pause the video if you want to see them. Okay. Explaining inflation. Economists describe 2 types of inflation: cost put, in which rising costs, usually wages, compel businesses to raise prices generally, and demand pull, in which decreasing demand rises prices generally, which they are reflected in the business's costs as workers demand wages hike to catch up with the rising cost of living. Whenever the sequence by which prices and costs rise in the economy, the fundamental cause is the same excessive demand, either for raw materials, finished goods, or labor. That outstrip of the economy's ability to respond to initial signs appears in the area with the greatest constraints: the labor market, the commodity market, and some areas of final output. Even before examining particular costs of price measures, practitioners, when considering inflation, look at indicators that might reveal when the economy faces such constraints. Cost-push inflation. In the area of cost-push inflation, analysts may look at commodity prices because commodities are an input to production, but because wages are the single biggest cost to production, practitioners focus primarily on wage-push inflation, which is tied to the labor market, because the object of the gauged demand for labor relative to capacity. The unemployment rate is key, as well as measures of the number of workers available to meet the economy's expanding needs. Obviously, the higher the unemployment rate, the lower the likelihood that shortages will develop in the labor market, whereas the lower the unemployment rate, the greater the likelihood that shortages will drive up wages. Because the unemployment rate generally only counts people who are looking for work, some practitioners argue that it fails to account for the economy's full labor potential, and they state that a tight labor market will bring people out in search of work and ease the potential wage strains. This accounts for the issue of and modifies the and modifies the unemployment rate indicator. This practitioner also looks at the participation rate of people in the labor force, arguing that it gives a fuller and more accurate picture of the potential than the unemployment rate. Analysis of these areas recognize that not all laborers are alike. Structure factors relating to training, differentiation, cultural patterns, and all are the same. In all or some of the population inefficiencies in the labor market, and the like can mean that the economy will effectively face labor shortages long before the unemployment rate reaches very low figures. This effective unemployment rate below which pressure emerges in labor markets, the frequency referred to as the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or drawn on the Nobel Prize winner of Milton Friedman, of the natural rate of unemployment of Nauru. Of course, these rates vary from one economy to another, and over time in a single economy, it is this rate, rather than a full employment rate, that determines when the economy will experience bottlenecks in the labor market and wage push inflation pressures. Thus, for example, the technology sector has grown rapidly in some of the economies that training in the labor force cannot keep up with demand. The sector can as a consequence face shortages in trained workers and attend wage pressure, even though the economy as a whole seems to have a considerable slack in the overall labor market. Until training or supply catches up with the demand, the economy may experience wage and inflation pressure at rates of unemployment that in other places and circumstances might suggest ample slack in the labor market and much less wage push pressure. Assessments of wage push inflation can also consider direct observations of wage trends. When they accelerate, might force businesses to rise productions, initiating the wage push spiral mentioned earlier in this reading. Statistical agencies provide a wide array of wage cost indicators, such as hourly wage gauge, weekly earnings, and overall labor costs, including the outlays of benefits. Some of these indicators include the effects of special overtime pay or bonuses. Others do not. Although these measures gives an idea of the cost to businesses, and hence the kind of wage push inflation pressures, a complete price only emerges when practitioners examine such trends alongside productivity measures. Productivity or output per hour is an essential part of wage push inflation analysis. Yeah, so the equation for the unit labor cost, for the cost for the labor. Many factors can affect labor productivity across time and between economies, as cyclical swings have already been described, and have the effect of technology and training. The pace of development also tends to increase worker productivity because more sophisticated equipment, systems, and technology workers have at their disposal, the higher their output per hour. Demand pull inflation, demand pull inflation is basically when there is high demand in the economy, and because of the high demand, sellers get to raise their prices, and when sellers get to raise their prices, inflation occurs. So there's no need for me. Yeah, inflation expectations. When people expect there to be inflation, they will spend more money. When they spend more money, sellers could increase their prices and when they increase their prices, then inflation occurs. Okay. Economic indicators. Should we get into that? Yeah, let's just get into that. As used in the business cycles context, the economic indicator is a variable that provides information that states of the overall economy. And economic indicators are often classified according to whether they lag, lead, or coincide with changes in the economy's growth. Leading economic indicators have turning points and usually precedes those of the overall economy. They are believed to have value for predicting the economy's future state. Usually near the coincident economic indicators have turning points that are usually close to those of the overall economy. They are believed to have values for identifying the economy's present state. Lagging economic indicators have turning points that take place later than those of the overall economy. They are believed to have value in identifying the economy's past conditions. To get as clear as a picture possible, practitioners frequently consider several related indicators simultaneously. What follows is a review of these indicators and how practitioners use them. Popular economic indicators include these: the weekly average, the S&P 500 index, some more right here. Okay. Let us consider a few examples that shows the use of some of these statistics in identifying a business cycle phase. In an increase in the reported ratio of customer installment debt in income lags or occurs after cyclical upturns. So the increase by itself would be evidence that the upturn has been underway. That could be considered to be an implication of positive change and coincident indicator that an expansion is in place. As the leading economic indicator, of positive change in the S&P 500 index is supposed to lead or come before an increase in aggregate economic activity. An increase in the S&P 500 will be positive for the future economic growth. All else equal, however, if the S&P 500 shows an increase, but the aggregate index did not, what would likely not draw an amount of two consecutive observations, we might conclude that a modest economic expansion is expected. Okay. Yeah, so these are just examples of leading economic indicators. Other variables used as economic indicators. In addition, there's an array of measures. Public agencies and trade associations provide aggregate cyclical measures. They may include surveys by industrialists, bankers, labor associations, and households on a state of their finances, levels of activity, and their confidence in the future. In the United States, for example, the Federal Reserve pulls its 12 branches of the quantitative report on business activity and expectations in their respective regions and summarizes those findings in what is called the Biage book, that release every 6 weeks. Also, in the United States, the Institute of Supply Management, ISM, pools its members to build indexes of manufacturing orders, outputs, and employment pricing, and comparable gauges for services over the last decade. So-called purchasing managers indexes along the lines of the ISM have been introduced in a wide range of countries, including Europe and China. Japan's industrial organization pools its members in a similar way, and the release of the findings is what we call the Tankan report. These delivers sources multiply when they are across economies. Practitioners can use these sources to assess whether they confirm or contradict other more broad-based cyclical indicators, given pause to it or greater confidence in these earlier conclusions using a statistical technique called principal component analysis. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago computes the Chicago Fed National Activity Index. The CFNAI is computed using 85 months of macroeconomic series. These series cover industrial production, personal income, capital utilization, employment by sectors, industrial production, personal income, capital utilization, employment by sector, housing starts, retail sales, and so on. Principal components analysis extracts the underlying trends that is common to most of these variables, thus distilling the essence of the U.S. business cycle. Similarly, the Bank of Italy, in conjunction with the Center of Economic Policy Research, produces the Euro coin statistic, which is also based on principles component analysis. There are more than 100 macroeconomic series following the Euro coin. The Euro coin also includes data derived from surveys, interest rates, and other financial variables. Both CFNAI and Euro coin are freely available online. Summary: the reading has summarized business cycle analysis. Among the points are made the following: the business cycles are the fundamental feature of a market economy, but their amplitude and length varies considerably. Business cycles have 4 phases: trough, expansion, peak, and contraction. Keynesian theories focus on fluctuations of aggregate demand, AD, and AD shifts left. As if AD shifts left, Keynesians advocate government intervention to restore full employment to avoid deflationary spirals. Monetarists argue that the timing of government policies is uncertain and generally better to let the economy find its new equilibrium unassisted, but ensures that the money supply is kept growing at an even pace. The new classical and the real business cycles, or RBC theorists, also considers fluctuations of aggregate supply, or AS. If AS shifts left because of an input price increase, or right because of the price decrease or technical progress, the economy will gradually converge to this new equilibrium. Government intervention is generally not necessary because it may exacerbate the fluctuation or delay the convergence to equilibrium. New Keynesians argue that frictions in the economy may prevent convergence and government policies may be needed. The demand for factors of production may change in the short run, and as a result of changes in the components of GDP, consumption, e.g. household wary about the future, save more and thus shift AD left. Investment, e.g. companies expect the consumers to increase demand and buy new equipment, thus shifting AD right. Another example of the companies introduces new technology, thus shifting long-term aggregate supply right. Government, e.g. fiscal and monetary policy shifts AD. The net exports, e.g. faster growth in other countries, generates high demand for homes countries' products, thus shifting AD, or higher prices of inputs, import shifts AS left. Any shifts in AD and AS will affect the demand for the factors of production, capital, land, and labor that are used to produce the new level of GDP. Unemployment has different subcategories. Frictional people that are not weak working, but they are in between jobs. Structural people that are unemployed because they do not have the skills required by opening the residence, opening or reside far away from the job. Discouraged workers are unemployed people who have given up looking for a job because they do not believe they could find one. There are different types of inflation. Hyperinflation indicates a high 100% annual increasing rate of inflation. Deflation indicates a negative inflation rate. Price decreases. Imported inflation is associated with increasing costs of inputs that comes from abroad. Demand inflation is caused by constraints in production that prevent companies from making as many goods as the market demand. It is sometimes called the wartime inflation because in times of war, goods tend to be rationed. Economic indicators are statistics on macroeconomic variables that help in understanding which stages the business cycle and economy is at. Of particular importance is the leading indicators, which suggest where the economy is likely to be in the near future. No economic indicator is perfect, as many of these statistics are subject to periodic revisions. Price levels are affected by real factors and monitoring factors. Real factors include aggregate supply. An increase in supply leads to lower prices. And aggregate demand, an increase in demand leads to higher prices. Monetary factors include the supply of money. More money circulating if the economy is in an equilibrium will lead to higher prices, and the velocity of money, higher velocity if the economy is in an equilibrium, will lead to higher prices. Inflation is measured by many indexes. Consumer Price Index reflects the prices of the basket of goods and services that is typically purchased by a normal household. Producer Price Index measures the cost of basket for raw materials, intermediate inputs, and finished products. GDP deflators measure the price of the basket of goods and services within the economy in a given year. Core Index excludes volatile items such as agricultural products and energy, whose prices tend to vary more than other goods. Okay, so here is the CFA Level 1 Reading 17 done. It also concludes our economics part 1 and for our CFA level 1 program curriculum. So we're going to continue with economics part 2 in our future reading, starting with reading study session 5, reading 18. So I do hope my readings have been helpful, and I hope to see you guys next time. Okay, goodbye.